Hello from Geneva. My name is Mia Dambach. I am the Executive Director of Child Identity Protection, which is an international NGO safeguarding children's identity rights through research, reforms, and advocacy. It's a real pleasure for me to speak to you today about a subject that's close to my heart, as well as, of course, a topic that affects so many millions of children, such as the 237 million children across the world that do not have a birth certificate, the 8 million children born through anonymous methods, the 14 million girl brides across the world, millions affected by emergency situations, either because of armed conflict, natural disasters, the over 1 million inter-country adoptees that have been adopted to date, and of course, the millions of other children whose identity rights are at risk. The mission of Child Identity Protection, otherwise known as CHIP, is to work with states and other stakeholders to promote universal birth registration and the full documentation of family relations. So in terms of a brief background into the organisation, we're established at the end of 2020 in Geneva. So we're guided by international standards, including Article 7 and 8 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which basically say that the child has a right to an identity, including birth registration, name, nationality, and family relations. And it's this aspect of family relations that we believe has really been under the radar, hasn't received much attention. Because we are a modest team, mostly made up of lawyers, our main partners are the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, UNICEF, UNHCR, the Hague Conference on Private International Law, Council of Europe, civil society actors, governments, universities, and organisations led by persons with lived experience. We alone will not be able to tackle the problem of children not having their identity rights respected, but we work closely with these partners to make sure that we can make some improvements. In terms of the issue of identity, it is definitely growing in importance across the world. We can see this at an international level with Sustainable Development Goal 16.9, legal identity, UNICEF's Child Protection Strategy from 2022 to 2030 states that its #1 strategic objective is legal identity. We also see it through UNHCR's I Belong campaign, the Committee on the Rights of the Child's different concluding observations and recommendations, but more importantly, with lived experience of children and young people and now adults speaking about the importance of identity, it is definitely growing. We also see it at a national level with different governments working on the issue with legislation. Also, we can see it through the different ways of social media where people and in films about identity. In terms of CHIP's initiatives, we work on a number of fronts. We work through research, advocacy, policy briefs, treaty body mainstreaming at the UN, our Experts Chip In series, which I think you've seen a couple of our videos, short ones, webinars, and with the resources that we make available on our website. They're always available in English, French, and Spanish, our working languages. We see it through our human rights reporting. We systematically submit to the Committee on the Rights of the Child short briefs, about 2 to 3 pages, on the main identity rights of states that they're examining. They're available on our website, but also the news section, which is where we try to put on the main resources and the main developments, like resolutions that are adopted at the UN, to disseminate that to the greater public, but also through our signature publication. This signature publication zooms in on the issue of identity rights, speaking specifically about family relations, but also broadly about those other identity rights, such as birth registration, nationality, name. So we use this signature publication to look at identity through 5 main stages. The first stage being the way it is created, which is usually at birth. The modification of identity, because sometimes that original identity may be modified. Then in some cases, it may be falsified. And then based on these three stages, creation, modification, falsification, it's important that these identity elements are preserved. So that is that it's collected, preserved, as well as then accessible. And then if any of this information is missing, Article 8.2 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child clearly states that states have a responsibility to speedily re-establish those missing elements. Now, I'm not aware of many states that are doing much to restore identity elements, but let alone speedily. So I think that this is a real area that we can improve on. So now let's look at this first aspect, the creation of the child's identity. And when I talk about the creation, I'll talk about the main issues, give some country examples, and then talk about what child identity protection, or CHIP, is doing in this area of creation. So when we look at the creation of a child's identity, it's the right of the child to have all the constituent elements of their identity inscribed in an official document. So the ECOSOC definition of legal identity is that it needs to include the name of the child, the date of birth of the child, the place of birth of the child, as well as the gender, which are all very important, and we fully support those elements being inscribed. But we would go further as an organisation to say that it needs to go beyond legal identity to include all aspects related to the origins of the child, the family relations of the child. If we fully want to respect this Article 7 and 8 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, it has this aspect of family relations. Despite this right being in international standards, there are a number of practical obstacles. We can see that there are fees, so monetary costs, registration fees exist, or late and delayed registration fees exist. Sometimes there is also certification. So once the child's registered, you need to pay for the certificate. And these are real barriers for families to access their birth certificates. Then there may be geographical challenges where the civil registries and vital statistics offices are based in capital or in cities. So for those who are living in rural areas or nomadic life, that's very difficult for them. Or even in the Pacifics, you can see that living on small islands makes it difficult to be able to register your child. People say, then what about online? But even then, it still may be difficult if they have very poor access to computers or to the internet or just Wi-Fi. Then in some countries, there are discrimination issues where informants have to be men, for example, in Afghanistan, Bhutan, Djibouti, Kenya, Maldives, Tunisia, just to name a few countries. But for example, in other countries, women can only in exceptional circumstances register their children. For example, in Fiji, if a father has died or fallen ill or is absent, unable to register the child. Other discrimination is you need a marriage certificate. And even if you look at Iran, even if you don't need a marriage certificate, if you have a child born out of wedlock, it is a crime. And so it might not just be the civil registration rules that are difficult, but it might be the penal code that is a problem, and also the issue of adolescent girls. So they're the main practical challenges across the globe. But then if we zoom into specific areas, you can also see, for example, where children are abandoned. They may not have information then about their origins, either the date of birth or the place of birth. And in some countries that allow baby boxes or hatches, we believe that this is a way that actually proactively encourages anonymous births. Even laws such as in France, the naissance sous X, or in Luxembourg, this means that children will never, ever have information about who their mother, father, or potential siblings or their wider family are. Then in assisted reproductive technologies, there are real issues when we allow for the use of anonymous gametes. So when we don't know who the sperm donor is, or we don't know who the egg donor is, then that child is missing fundamental information about their biological origins. Then if we look at surrogacy, in some countries such as Georgia, Ukraine, and Russia, the details of the surrogate mother are not kept anywhere. And then this again means that biological origins are not kept for the child. If we looked at emergency situations, just to name a few examples, even before the war in Ukraine, with the Russian invasion had started, I was working in Ukraine for UNICEF, and they explained to me that in the non-government controlled areas, yes, the children were being given birth certificates, but these birth certificates weren't then recognized by the authorities in Kiev, and it was very expensive to go to Kiev from Donetsk, for example. Also, if you look at Côte d'Ivoire, with the conflict up in the north, for those opposing parties, these armed conflict, their aim was to destroy the civil registration and vital statistic systems, and they had to and they were made and they were in paper, so those archives had to be rebuilt. If you look at Samoa, another barrier in an emergency situation, not related to armed conflict, but to COVID, was that the opening hours were quite limited during COVID. So it meant that if you couldn't come between, I forgot at the times, but between 10 and 12, then you couldn't register your child. Then there are also issues for children born from conflict-related sexual violence. For example, in the Democratic Republic of Congo or South Sudan, I remember watching a really sad testimony of a woman saying, of course, I don't know who the father is. There were so many men who raped me. I closed my eyes and I just wished that this incident would stop. So there are some real difficulties for children having full information about their origins. So what is CHIP doing to try and improve this situation? Of course, we're not going to resolve every single challenge, but we can do our part, and we do this with our partners. So one of the main projects we're working on at the moment is we're developing a legal atlas of every country in the world, of their birth registration laws, looking at what works well and what needs improvement. So last year we worked on 30 countries. This year we're hoping to work on another 30 countries, and then once we hit about 90 or 100, it will be launched, because it can't really be a legal atlas when there's only 30 countries. And so we hope that people can be inspired by looking at the different laws of different countries. Another project that we're working on, which I'm really looking forward to going into Senegal, is with UNICEF again, is we're doing a twinning of the birth registration and education system, because in this country, in this region, you can't go to school without a birth certificate. So in Senegal, they have set up a protocol, which is really innovative, that when the child tries to register at school and they don't have a birth certificate, or their parents don't have a birth certificate, they have a moving court system that moves to the school, and then they register the children at these moving courts. And our aim as CHIP will be to do an evaluation of that system by going into Dakar and then into the outer regions where birth registration rates are really low, and to see what's working well, and again, how we can improve this protocol. So that's for Senegal, but then the whole idea is to then disseminate this protocol and this practice into other countries. We're looking at, for next year, Cameroon, Burkina Faso, and Côte d'Ivoire. Then another example of what we do is we work at the UN to put input into different resolutions that are relevant, such as the 2023 one on birth registration. We give policy advice to governments. Just this month, we gave some advice to South Korea on their 2023 bill on anonymous hospital births, trying to encourage them to adapt this bill so that it includes a bit more information about the mother. So that's where we're working on creation of a child's identity. And now we move on to modification of the child's identity. There are, in international standards, several permissible situations where a child's identity can be modified according to international standards. And to do that, it's really important that the best interests of the child are the primary consideration. It's not just a consideration, but the primary consideration. And this is important when we're looking at changing the child's original identity and giving them a new family. Because if you do it inappropriately, there are massive ramifications, lifelong ramifications, but also into future generations. And so any decision which leads to the modification of the child's identity should be done with a best interest assessment or best interest determination. UNHCR has a fantastic tool that they updated in 2021. And you'll see that one of the elements when they're doing this assessment is really identity issues. The links with the family members, not just immediate, but also the wider family, also cultural ties, language, religion. It needs to be carried out by competent and qualified professionals. And I think very important, something that we all agree on now, but still we could work on, is the participation of relevant parties, especially the child. And again, if we zoom into a number of topics that we looked at in the signature publication, you look at alternative care. If we're moving children from their birth families into alternative care, maybe kinship care, or maybe foster care, or even into residential care, if that has to be a solution, it's really important that contact is maintained with the birth family and reintegration efforts continue. One of the promising practices that we worked on in Cambodia with UNICEF in my former position was really that they had this fantastic goal between 2016 2019 to reintegrate 30% of children that were in residential care. And that meant that over 15,000 children could be reunited with their families. And I think that that's a really good way of showing the preservation of the child's family relations. Of course, it can only happen if it's in the best interest of the child, because maybe it's not safe to reintegrate the child. Then if you look at adoption, it's especially full adoptions. We're really severing the child's family ties and creating a new set of family ties. So it's really important that this is done in the best interest of the child. But what I think is a really promising practice, or that's been going on for such a long time now, and is the open adoption system in New Zealand. And now what I've heard from people, adoptees with lived experience, is that they're really pushing for simple adoptions, even in inter-country adoptions, where there's a way to maintain that tie. Funnily enough, I did an interview with a young person just yesterday, and she was saying to me, why do we have to give a clean slate to adoptees? It's not the truth. I have a past, and I want to know that past, and I want to own that past. And it's not like I have a maximum limit of what I can include in my identity. I think that was really helpful, that she was saying, it's okay to have lots of identity elements. It makes me richer. Whereas this system of full adoptions is really cut these ties, only limited to the new identity in the receiving state. And that doesn't really benefit the child. It may benefit other people, but it doesn't benefit the child or the adoptee. Then if you look at assisted reproductive technologies, where the surrogate mother is the mother at birth, if we then transfer that legal parentage to the intending parents, we are modifying the child's identity at birth. And that may be okay, but I think it's really important that that type of information is recorded, that there's the consent of the surrogate mother, that the intending parents have had some type of an assessment to make sure that they're not going to put the children in any form of harm. And most importantly, that money hasn't been used for that exchange of legal parentage, because if it has, then it's quite clear in Article 2A of the optional protocol on the Convention on the Rights of the Child that there is sale of children. Then we also look at emergency situations where the child's modification of their identity can also occur. So what has CHIP been doing since 2020? Well, we've worked on a briefing note on children's rights and surrogacy with UNICEF. It's only 2 pages, but I can assure you, to get this approved through the bureaucracy and for UNICEF to take a position on elements that need to be respected if surrogacy is going to occur, it took us over a year to get there. So both organizations are not saying we're for surrogacy or that we're against it, but what we are saying is that if it is to occur, that it really needs to be done in a way that respects children's rights, in particular their right not to be sold and to have their identity preserved. We also had a mandate for technical assistance to Guatemala to work on standard operating procedure for their the authority that's working on national adoption. So we're, of course, pushing the preservation of identity there. We do a number of webinars with different partners. You can see a couple on the PowerPoint slides, but they're all available and recorded and on our website. And then, of course, our Experts Chip In series. Then as we move on to the child's identity has been created or it's been modified, unfortunately, in some situations, it may be falsified. And when this occurs, it really damages children, and it can put them at a greater risk of sale, trafficking, and sexual exploitation because nobody knows that they exist. It's not a real identity, so nobody's accountable for this false identity. And a number of reasons exist for this, aside from the fact that there may be weak civil registration of vital statistic systems that we spoke about in the creation of the child's identity. There may be a lack of regulation, corruption, commercial interests. I know that for example, in some countries in Africa, you can easily buy a birth certificate for $10. That there may also be falsification of the child's identity in situations such as harmful traditional practices, child brides. For us, having a child married at 12, 13, or according to the committee, any child under 18 is a falsification or an improper modification of the child's identity. She was at birth given an identity and then has been married off and given a new civil status. So this is where it's falsification. Also, it could be due to discrimination. So in some cases, we use false names in birth certificates in Egypt, Jordan, and Palestine for children born out of wedlock. So they're just a few examples. But it's something that is a real issue. And particularly if we zoom in again on these 4 topics that we addressed in the signature publication, in alternative care, where you have paper orphans, they're not really orphans, but we make sure that they are because it means then that we can funnel them through into adoption. And so they're in residential care, or even with orphan tourism. I remember in a previous job, I was working with UNICEF Ghana, and we were doing an evaluation. And we went to the residential care, and they were telling us that there are residential care programs that are set up over the school holidays in Ghana, and they invite children from the community living with their families to come. and stay there for the holidays during these camps. And in the meanwhile, foreigners are coming to visit these residential care camps, believing that these children are orphans, and then investing, like they give them computers or they give them some infrastructure, beds or money, or they're supporting an orphan. And this for us is real orphan tourism. So you're making money and you're falsifying this child's identity. Even if it's temporary, it is a falsification of the child's identity. Then in adoption, there is simulation of birth certificates of children that are adopted, which is a real issue in the Philippines, for example, where they would put the adoptive parents as the birth parents. And one other example that always is a bit of a shock for me, and I continue to give Ukraine as an example only because I've worked there, is the fact that, but it's also a practice that's in a lot of the other Eastern European countries. In adoption, the civil code of procedure allows you to change the name, the date of birth, as well as the place of birth of the child. In that case, when the child's adopted, if the child's ever adopted, it will be very difficult for them to know their birth family. Then also in assisted reproductive technology, if you look at surrogacy, if the surrogate mother is erased from all records, or she's not, information about her is not recorded, then we're creating paper biological children, because people think that the intending parents are my birth parents, but really they're not. And so for us, this is also falsification of the child's identity, because a birth certificate is at birth, the normal understanding or the general understanding is that this is the woman that gave birth to you. Then in emergency situations, you saw or will see the film from Judge Pangalangan, who was the ICC judge, and you'll see how children's identities, whether as child brides or as armed, being part of armed soldiers, is also falsified. So what is CHIP doing here? What we've done in the area of adoption is we've joined this consortium of adoptees with associations who've established associations called Voices Against Illegal Adoptions, and we did some advocacy work within the UN. And in last year, they came up then with a joint statement on illegal intercountry adoptions and how this should be addressed. We also have our expert chip-in series. We also developed some fact sheets that contributed to the Special Commission last year by the Hague Conference on Private International Law. We also give advice to governments and different media channels. For example, some that could be helpful is the recent judgment at the European Court of Human Rights. And we gave this policy advice to Denmark, explaining to them that we agreed with the minority. It was a 4-3 judgment that said that you can use adoptions to regularize the parent-child relationship. And we said that in this situation, where the consent of the surrogate mother had been paid for, to regularize it through adoption would be the sale of children. And so we supported Denmark and the Supreme Court there, and we hope that that advice will be helpful for them. Then as we come to the preservation of the child's identity, so we've had the child's identity created, modified, and potentially falsified. Here, in all those stages, it's really important that information is collected, and as much information. I've never, ever to this date, and I've been working in this field for over 20 years, had a child say to me, or an older person say to me, oh, too much information was gathered. I think every bit of information is so precious to a child or to an older person who's looking to know their origins. Then there's preservation, guaranteeing that information is preserved indefinitely, not just even for 20 years, 30 years, or for the lifetime of the child, because it may not be that person that is interested, but future generations. And then it's also very important that this information is accessible, and if need be, that there should be adequate legal and psychosocial support. It doesn't need to be mandatory, especially if you're accessing information about yourself, but if you do need it, then it should be available. So again, zooming in onto these 4 topics that we looked at in our signature publication, there is alternative care. I remember working in Haiti, and they came to me, the social workers at the IBSR, which is Institut de Bien-être, the main authority working for children in Haiti, based in Port-au-Prince. And she came to me with dossiers, or the child's files, explaining to me the work that they were doing. And of course, they were showing me the best files that they had. So the senior social worker said to me, look, here is an example of a child where we've documented, and it had, the aunt had said, I cannot look after my niece, and she'd signed it. And the social worker was saying, see, we are collecting information about the child's origins. And I said to her, but do you know why the aunt couldn't look after the child? And she said to me, yeah, of course. It's because she already had 5 children and her husband was unemployed. And I said, but is that noted anywhere on the child's file? And she said to me, no, but is that important? And so it's this kind of work, it's this kind of training of social workers, giving them the time they need, because many times they don't have the time they need to collect all this information. But giving them that opportunity to record all this valuable information as to why the child couldn't be cared for by the wider family. I think it's really important to know that the issue wasn't with the child, but was more with the capacity of the extended family. There's also in adoption, I have spoken to a number of receiving states and their central adoption authorities in intercountry adoption matters, and they've said to me that if the birth family ever contacts the child, a lot of them are just putting these letters in the child's file, and which can be accessible when they're 18. I find that a bit problematic in the sense that, especially in cases where there's illicit adoptions, because the child is being robbed of information, important information. I don't think that they should write them a letter and say, hey, your birth mother has been contacting you and you've been illicitly adopted, because that would be a bit of a shock to receive that. But there should be a way where you can write to the child and say, hey, there is some information, new information about your origins on your file that you can access with support if you want, or just feel free to contact us. But to rob the child of this information, especially in illicit adoption cases, I think is a real problem. So if you put yourself in the place of these birth families, if your child had been illegally adopted and the authority said to you, well, I'm sorry, but teenage years are very turbulent, we don't want to disturb them even more, you would go crazy. You would say, no, this child needs to know that I never gave my consent, that I'm still looking for this child, and and they need to know their origins. Also, I think that in assisted reproductive technologies, it's really important that medical clinics give over that information about which gametes were used, which surrogate mother was used, and it needs to be centralized by an authority. And for states that don't actually proactively allow surrogacy, but it's nevertheless occurring in their territory, they need to regulate all their actors. They need to be able to say, hey, this is happening and we need to centralize this information. So what is child identity protection doing in this field? Well, we've got a number of briefing notes. We've given a legal opinion on the Irish Birth Information Tracing Bill. We've done some research, and so we're really trying to encourage states to collect, preserve, and to make accessible this information. Because one of the problems with the EU General Data Protection Rules is that Article 8 of that legislation is being used against the adoptee or the person in care to say that the privacy of the other people that may be in the files needs to be protected, and so you cannot access all the information about your file. So it's redacted and all the names and information about these other people, but the child has a right to know their origins, their family relations, and why they were put in the system. So if this briefing note, we hope will help states have legislation that is more in line with the child's right to identity. And finally, to conclude, we have restoration. So I think restoration is really important, especially because we have so many children, young people, and those with lived experience complaining that they have missing elements of their identity. And when they discover these elements are missing, it's often too late. Statutes of limitations exist, or information just may blanketly be missing because they've never, ever collected that information. Also, if there was criminal and illicit practices that involve the burdens of proof, of course, can be high. And there may also be a lack of political will, like the governments today may say, but that happened 30 or 40 years ago, and it's not my government that's responsible. What I do think is a promising practice in this field is Australia, for example. Even though as an Aussie, it's one of those proud moments, but internationally it's well accepted and used often, these apologies to say, I'm sorry, we did wrong. It's the beginning of restoration of the identity of these people. And it can occur in so many ways, in alternative care, also with adoption. So if you look at intercountry adoption, there are a number of inquiries now occurring in Belgium, Netherlands, Switzerland, France, but also in states of origin, Chile and Korea. There's a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I think the most promising searches for origins are in Colombia, and there's also a good project here in Switzerland where the Central Adoption Authority has funded Sri Lankan adoptees to do the searches themselves and to get trained. Assisted reproductive technologies, the initiatives requesting the lifting anonymity. There's the Affiliation Centre in Belgium, which is fully funded by the government, and I think they're working on adoption, but also ART. Good Law is the Victorian Assisted Reproductive Technology Act in Victoria, which I think is also going to be launched in Queensland. And of course, the Restoring Family Links with the ICRC, the International Commission of Red Cross. So what are states doing? I mean, what's CHIP doing in this area? We've done some research for the Belgium Central Adoption Authority, the Flemish, on about 22 countries, looking at what they do to preserve identity, what they do to preserve origins, how they help adoptees access their origins when they're older. And this has all gone into some major assessment over all of the country to see whether they will continue to work with those countries or not. And so we had to code the countries into red, orange, yellow, and green. And so we were able to see whether there were services available, whether adoptee associations. We provide also informal support to states investigating illegal adoptions. I recently spoke to the Committee on Health and Equal Opportunities in Belgium on the new law that they're doing for assisted reproductive technology. Our president spoke to Denmark Committee on Surrogacy, and we also do our work with UN treaty bodies. So to conclude, we're really excited that this organization, CHIP, it now exists. It's a real honor for us to work with different partners, to work with different organizations, to do our part to make sure the child's right to identity is better protected. So if you have any questions, please contact us, and we look forward to collaborating with as many people as possible to tackle this problem. Thank you.